Alrighty, we are back again, and we're just going to barrel on through because I want to make the most of our limited time together. We'll have a chance for conversation and at lunch and between sessions, and we can stick around even after the last session if you got any questions or anything you just want to sit and chat about. We can do that. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Assemblies of God, and like most of you who are in a denomination, we have our annual conference for Southern California, and we go every year and participate with it. Love the group we're in. And every year, our district superintendent, who's in charge of all of the churches over Southern Cal, does what he's supposed to do, which is give the annual kind of state of the district report. Here's how we're doing. Here are the churches we planted. Here are the churches that closed. Here's the average age of ministers, all this stuff. And a lot of it is statistical, as appropriately so. The numbers are a part of that process. And every year he gives, part of the statistics that he gives are church size statistics. And for every year that I've been around, one of those statistics that he's given, how did I go back to that? There we go, is this. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, and over 80% of our churches are under 100. A statistic that is shockingly consistent denomination to denomination and region to region. In the U.S., on average, it's 90% under 200 and about 65% under 100. That has been a recent change in recent years because the phenomenon of megachurches is skewing the numbers a little bit higher. But throughout the rest of the world and in most denominational situations, within a couple percentage points, that's just the way it is everywhere. So he would get up and do that every year. And I'm talking about a couple different district supers over a couple of different eras. And they would give that stat, and the next sentence that would follow it would always be some version of, we need to fix this. It was always assumed that those numbers meant a problem. Always. And I would sit there every year, and I would listen to it, and I would think, oh no. I'm one of those problem churches. I'm making the problem worse. For a large part of it, we were one of the 80%, and for the entire time, except for that one little blip, we were part of the 90%. Oh no, I'm part of the problem. I got to fix this. That was every message that I got was, that's a problem. Oh no. And then one year during the middle of this whole kind of meltdown season that I told you about, he starts giving the thing and he gives the stats. And have you ever been in a room where somebody's talking, preacher or whatever, or teacher in a college class, whatever, and they're talking and they say something that triggers your thought process to go way over here. They keep talking, but you are not paying attention anymore. It may be happening to some of you right now. Come on back. And that happened to me. I went off here and he went on his way and I went off. I didn't hear the next 20 minutes. Because at that moment I shifted from oh no to so what? Okay, fine. My church is small. Most of the churches are small. So what? I just don't care anymore. I can't fix it, so it doesn't matter. So what? And I went home sitting with so what? And then I'm just the kind of guy that decides, I'm not just going to say so what, I'm going to find out so what. So I did some so what research. Okay. 90% of the churches are under 200 and 80% are under 100. What's the so what behind that? Where does that come from? What does that actually mean? And here's what I discovered. That stat says nothing about the health of the denomination or the region in question. And here's why. If the church is in revival, the denomination is in revival, the region is in revival, a big part of the way that they're growing is by the planting of churches, and those churches are all going to be small churches. When a denomination or a region is in revival, there are more small churches because you're planting more churches. So the percentage of small churches stays very high. If a church is in decline, then all the existing churches are becoming smaller, or most at least of the existing churches are becoming smaller. Therefore, there are going to be more small churches because the medium-sized churches are becoming small churches. And so the percentage of small churches stays high. So whether the church is in revival or decline, the percentage of small churches is always very high. It's been that way for 2,000 years. It's not likely to change because of the next church growth book. It's been that way forever. So that says nothing about the health of that group, of that denomination, of that region. It says absolutely nothing. Now, it's not an unimportant stat. It's simply not the be-all, end-all stat. It should be taken in with all the other information, but don't make assumptions based on that stat alone. It's not enough. So I sat with the so what, and I sat with it a little too long, quite frankly. And if you stay with so what for too long, you become hard and you become cynical. Don't sit with so what for too long. You got to go through so what, but you got to go through so what. You got to get to the other side. And on the other side of so what, I came out at, okay, now what? All right, our church is small. Now what? Actually, about a year after coming out of that counseling time, and the church had gone well under 100, so we were at 200. We had gone up to 400 in less than 2 years. In less than a year, we went down under 100, which means we lost over half of the people we started the growth spurt with. And there was no scandal and there was no split. It was just this whole unhealthy period of time. And then we kind of righted the ship and we were getting back together. We were getting healthy again. And the numbers hadn't really gone up all that much. And so I started talking about, we got to get the numbers up. And I heard the words coming out of my mouth and I stopped myself in the middle of it and said, no, I'm done. We got to stop thinking like a big church. And I only believed it after I heard myself say it. Right? Have you ever done that? You say or write something and you go, oh, I didn't know I believed that until I just wrote that down. Right? It was only after I heard it fall out of my face that I went, yeah, we got to stop thinking like a big church. And everybody in the room, their jaws hit the floor because that's the mantra of the church growth movement. If you want to be a big church, you got to think like a big church. And I said, we got to stop thinking like a big church for a simple reason, because we're not one. What does a healthy small church look like? And nobody in the room, including me, knew the answer. So I said, okay, we got to figure out now what. Now, a couple illustrations to get you to the now what spot. Apollo 13, the movie, has a great scene in it, a bunch of great scenes. There's one scene in the movie Apollo 13 in which the astronauts have not been able to land on the moon. Their spaceship is damaged. And because they weren't on the moon, so they weren't in that one part of the spaceship, all of the air filters in the part that they've had to stay in are now clogged. They're all used up. They can't use the air filters anymore, and they're about to kill themselves on their own carbon dioxide emissions. And on Earth, they're trying to figure out how to fix this, and they realize, oh, there are filters in the other part. They can just go in there and get them. But the problem is the filters in that part don't fit the filter in this part. They made two different types of filters. Right? And the guy goes, tell me this isn't a government project. Like, seriously, really? We couldn't have just had the same filter in both parts? No, we had to have different ones. So they've literally got to figure out how they put a square, round peg into a square hole or vice versa. And they can't figure it out. So the very next scene, an engineer takes a couple engineers take a couple boxes and they dump them out on a big table. And they essentially say this, everything that is on this table is everything that is on Apollo 13. If it's not on the table, it's not on Apollo 13 and the astronauts can't use it. So, using only what is on this table, we have to figure out how to fit this into this or they die, go. That's your job. I do not know of a better description for what it's like to be a small church pastor than that. Really, God, this is the mess you gave me? None of what you gave me is designed to do the job that I'm called to do, but the mission has not changed. And lives are at stake. Get the job done. That's our assignment. Right? We're always cobbling stuff together and going, but this doesn't, well, the big church, they get to design it from scratch. They get to engineer it perfectly. Yeah, that's what happens when you got tons of resources and tons of time. We don't. But the answer is still the same. Get the job done. The mission is the same. The mission has not changed. We just got to figure out how to do it with an Apollo 13 table mess. It's been said that the first job of leadership is to define reality. I don't know a better picture of defining reality than that little clip from that movie. That right there. This table is our reality defined. You can't define it any clearer than that. See, it's not faith to pray that something appears on the table that isn't on the table, because even if it appears on your table, it's not going to appear on Apollo 13. Faith doesn't say, oh, we can't do it with this. Faith says, this is what we've got, and we're going to get it done anyway. Faith doesn't say, oh no, we're going to pray something onto the table that doesn't exist. That's not faith, that's fantasy. Faith says, this is my reality, and God is still going to do his mission with my reality, because Jesus didn't wake up this morning depressed by the size of your church. You may have, but he didn't. So we got to get the job done. There's another saying that's real popular now, and it's actually a really good one. Get the right people on the bus. Everybody's saying that now. Have you heard it? Get the right people on the bus. It's a leadership term. And what it means is if you're putting a staff together, you're putting your team together, you got to have the right people on your team, because if you have one person on the bus that shouldn't be on it, then the whole thing can fall to pieces. The team can fall apart over one badly matched person. So you've got to get the right people on the bus. The challenge in a small church is get the right people on the bus. Dude, these are my people. This is my bus. No. I'd love to get one right person on my bus. All I got is this Apollo 13 table mess. There's not a single thing on that table that's designed to do the job that I'm assigned to do. But that's where the really good engineers shine. They figured it out. Now there's some engineering. Anybody can engineer an air filter when they've got all the time, all the money, all the resources in the world. But if you can figure out how to do that with that mess, now you got yourself an engineer. They know their stuff. And that's what we're called to do all the time. I said it before. Rick Warren can't do my job. I can't do his. So that's not a diss on him. It's not a diss on me. We have different jobs. I couldn't do his. He can't do mine. Did he pastor a church of my size? Yeah, for like 2 weeks. You know, he blasted right on through that. If he'd been stuck under 200 for 20 years, let's see what kind of mental state he'd be in today. Right? He's not built for that. And I'm glad he's not built for that. I'm glad he's built to do what he's done, and I'm glad he's done what he's done. He's not built for what I do. I'm not built for what he does. There's no jealousy there. It's just different. That's okay. You know? And I've got to look at that and go, I'm doing the Apollo 13 mess thing. That's my assignment. So don't fight it. Get it done. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. It's a specialty, and it's worth doing well. And we got to get that drilled into our heads and hearts. I'm not being penalized. This is a specialty. This is a specialty that God has called me to do. And we're going to do it. We're going to get figured out. Now we're going to move into what I like to call the why is my church so weird part of the day. Yes, I know your church is weird. I'm going to tell you why in a bit. All right, from here we're going to move into this, back to these circles that I said we'd get into. The difference between big and small churches predominantly comes down to something called the law of large numbers. The law of large numbers is a sociological phenomenon that says the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably they behave. This is how polling companies work. They know that if you get a large enough sample size, you can just add zeros and be right within a 2 to 3 point margin of error, right? So that if they survey 3,500 Americans, they can tell you how all of America feels. And every time you see one, you go, they never asked me. They don't have to. If you ask the right questions of the right demographic group, and here's the third key, and have a minimum sample size, all you got to do is add zeros. It scales up. But you got to have a minimum sample size. So here's what typically happens. If you go to a conference, you got a pastor speaking who's pastoring a church of 20,000 people. And if you pastor a church of 2,000 people, you can take virtually everything that they say, take it home and do it, and just drop a zero, because your Venn diagram circles almost completely overlap. Because at 2,000, you've got multiple staff, you've got multiple venues probably, you've got parking issues, you've got age-appropriate classrooms for everybody, you've got all of the different programs from recovery to benevolence to everything else in place. It's just 1/10 the size of the church of 20,000. That's slightly oversimplified, but not much, right? Because you've got to have all of those things. By the 2,000 to 20,000, it's just more of. Okay, again, oversimplified, but not much. So 20,000 down to 2,000, drop a zero, you're good to go. 2,000 down to 200, it's no longer an issue of dropping a zero anymore. You're not in the left circle anymore. You're in the right circle. It's a different animal. It's not a matter of scaling anymore, because at 200, you may not have multiple staff. You don't have all of the subdivisions for age appropriate for everything. So it's not just a matter of scale. There are some things you simply don't do anymore, or you do very, very differently. And 200 down to 50, difference again. And in fact, when you get to those numbers, you can have two churches of 50 of the same denomination in the same town on the same street. And you might as well be on two separate planets. Why? Because this church of 50, they lose one family, say goodbye to the entire children's ministries department. And in this church of 50, when that one person that everybody loves doesn't show up one Sunday, we all breathe a little bit easier because we brought somebody new this week, and now I don't have to worry about that awkward confrontation in the lobby with weird Miss or Mr. So-and-so that we all love, but we all just kind of know how to navigate around, but the new person might not. Right? And every one of you just had a name pop into your head. Right? You know how I know that? Because every church has one. And if your church doesn't have one, some other poor church has two. I'm convinced there's 3 churches around us that don't have one. Took you a moment, but you got there with me. Now, the big church has one too, but that just means the pastor gets a weird email once a week. No big deal in a big church. But that one person can ruin your Sunday, and maybe has occasionally. Certainly has ruined your mood right before you're about to preach. Big church pastor doesn't have to worry about that. The number of people kind of levels those personality issues out. But the smaller the group, the reason that a bigger group behaves more predictably is because the size of the group kind of levels out the personality distinctions. Okay? The flip side, however, of this goes to these Wonder Bread circles. Now, in addition to big church essentials on the left, small church essentials on the right, so on the right, in the right big circle, it's all the things we share in common as small church pastors. We get together and go, oh, you got one of those people too? Oh yeah, me too. You've got that problem? Yeah, oh yeah, me too. So there's a whole bunch of me too going on in that circle on the right. In addition to that, however, there are things in your church that are completely different than any other church on the face of the earth. So you've got a little circle, and you'll notice those circles have 3 things about them. 1, they're all different sizes. 2, they're all different colors. And 3, here's the big issue, they don't touch. Because every one of those circles represents what is completely different about your church than any other church on the face of the earth. And here's the inverse correlation. The smaller your church is, the bigger your unique circle is. Because the smaller the church is, the more individual personalities come into play. So 20 people behave less predictably than 50 people behave. And 50 people behave less predictably than 100 people behave. Because the bigger the group, the more the individual personalities kind of flatten out and have a lesser effect on the whole. Make sense? Right? We hear it, we go, oh yeah, of course. So that's why your church is so weird. Because the smaller the group, the more the individual quirks and personalities come into play. And we can fight against it, or we can look at it and go, well, God gave me this. Maybe he gave it to me for a reason. And we can lean into it and figure out how to actually leverage that for the sake of the kingdom of God. So the flip side of the law of large numbers is this. If the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably they behave, then the smaller the crowd, the more impact each person has. For good and for bad. For bad, we already talked about that. Folk that we got to work around them. We got to figure out a way. I went through so many years in our church. Every time we wanted to do something new, we had to figure out how are we going to work around Jack on this one. There's that one guy who was always going to resist any new thing. He was always going to have a problem with it. And it was always, okay, how do we get this one past Jack? How do we work around Jack? Everybody's got a Jack. Right? The last few years, we've been blessed not to have one. And everybody's on board. But there's going to be a season. Jack's going to come back. Not that Jack, but a different Jack. Jack will be back. Right? We all have one. So there's the negative, but there's also the positive. One of the primary reasons people say they go to a small church and pick a small church when they have a big church option, and that happens. I mean, in Orange County, there's thousands of, we know of the big churches, but there are far, far, far more small churches. A lot of people choose to go to small church even when there's a big church available. Why do they go? One of the primary reasons they mention is because I can have a greater impact in a smaller church. Now, some of that's negative. Some of that is control freak issues. And here just to give you, again, a difference between big and small. In big churches, let me put it this way. If you want to go to church, be a passive observer, and not get involved at all, and not be made to feel guilty that you're not getting involved, what size of a church are you going to go to? Big. You can disappear in a big church. Big church pastors know that, so healthy big churches are always pushing small groups and ministry teams. Because they recognize one of their challenges is they have to fight passivity, so they're always pushing people towards connection and activity. And then they come to us and they say, well, you got to have a small group too. And you go, okay, and we try and it doesn't work. Why? Because you already are a small group. We're not fighting passive, we're fighting passive aggressive. Right? Because if you're a control freak, what size of a church are you going to go to? Small. You're going to have more control at a small church. Control freaks don't show up at big churches because they got no control there. So we always have to fight the control freak. And sometimes, guys, the control freak is behind the pulpit. Right? We've got to recognize that. And so they're fighting against passivity. We're fighting against the control freak. Because each one attracts a different type of person. And it's just a difference between us that we have to recognize and we have to adapt to. So that, again, that's part of the bad. But the good part of that is, if you play some guitar and you walk into Saddleback Church on a Sunday morning, you're going to hear that band and you're going to go, I am never getting on that stage, am I? But if you walk into the average small church and you play some guitar, dude, you can be running that entire worship team in a month. They might have you play that morning. Right? And that's the reason a lot of people go to a smaller church, because they'll go, my gift is not appropriate for this size of a room. If you play some guitar, it's not good for the church or for the guitar player to put them on stage at Saddleback. That's not right. It doesn't make sense in that context. But a whole bunch of small churches would love somebody who's willing, who plays some guitar. Please, we're desperate for it. And all of a sudden that person has a gift that they can use in that context in a way they can't use it in a different context. Or they can teach, or they can help with design, or they can help with setup or tear down. There's a whole bunch of gifts that are available in the body of Christ that are far more appropriate for use in a small church than for a big church. Because in a big church, there's a level of professionalism and arrows on the floor precision that has to be followed or the thing falls apart. But in a smaller church, we can use the person who's still trying to figure it out. We would love to be able to use somebody who's not good at it yet, but willing. I'll take that any day of the week. And in a small church, that can be used. So it's not less than, it's simply different than. So people have impact. It's one of the reasons they want to go to a smaller church. So this is also why metrics are harder in a small church. Right? People ask, okay, if a small church can be healthy, what's the metric that measures health? And my answer is, there really aren't any that I know of. What's your metric for measuring a healthy family? I got metrics for measuring healthy companies. I don't have metrics for measuring healthy families. Because once you drop below the minimum sample size, numbers matter less and less and less, and they are an accurate measure far less and less. Here, for instance, here's a typical month at a typical church, small church. If you average 50 people, first Sunday you got 50 people. Next Sunday, 25. What happened? Church split? No, it's hunting season. Or lake season, or any one of flu season. The sun came out. Or in Southern California, it's drizzling. They're not going to go out in that. Yeah, we know how you make fun of us. We just lean into it. Right? That's just the way it is. The next Sunday, 75. Revival? No, you're dedicating a baby that morning and the entire extended family showed up. But that's the morning that the worship leader, if you have one, called and said, Pastor, I still got the flu, I can't show up. And so you get up and you lead a cappella badly. And as you're doing it, you look out at the biggest crowd of your year and go, not one of these news people is ever coming back. The next week, 50. Now, if you took a church of 500 and they had 500, then 250, then 750, then 500 in a given month, you got some serious schizophrenia going on. Because at the larger numbers, you have smaller changes. That's why they talk metrics so much. Because if you're pastoring 1,000, 2,000, 20,000 people, a 10% shift, if you're pastoring a church of 20,000, a 10% shift means 2,000 people. That's something worth paying attention to, right? So numbers matter at that size, because at that size, every number is a person. But numbers aren't people in smaller churches. People are people in smaller churches. The axiom just doesn't work in a smaller environment. We have these massive spikes and drops in numbers, and we can't live and die by them every week. It'll kill us. But in a big church, if they have a 15% shift, they had better pay attention, because something's going on, either up positive or down negative. It can change their budget. It can change their missions program. And that's why if you're in a denomination, send your numbers in every year. Assemblies of God, every year we got to send the massive sheet, 150 questions, all of them about numbers, Wednesday night, and conversions and baptisms and all this stuff. And there were several years I'd look at it and go, is there somewhere I can just write down, it stinks right now, leave me alone, and send it in? But every year I send it in faithfully. Why? Because on a denominational level, they're not dealing with 50 or 100 people. On a denominational level, they're dealing with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, nationally or internationally, millions of people. So they need accurate numbers, because small shifts, a 10%, when you're dealing with millions of people, a 10% shift up or down changes a ton of stuff. Your budgeting and the way you approach things, and whether or not you're moving forward or backward. So we need to report. So they're not obsessed with numbers for no good reason. They're obsessed with numbers because when you get to that size, the numbers have a bigger indication of health and of the decisions you make. But we just can't live and die by the numbers in a smaller group. They don't mean as much to us because of the size. So let me walk you through a couple other principles before we do a break for lunch here. One of the primary differences between big and small churches is that big church principles center on process, systems, and curriculum. So you go to a conference, and lately all they seem to be talking about is this new system, this new process, this new method, and then you break from the big thing and you go into this massive room where they're all trying to sell you the latest curriculum. I remember talking to a pastor a couple years ago, and he actually said to me, have they just forgotten about Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit? Are we just going to save the world through methods now? And I thought about it and thought, no, I don't think that's the case. I think what it is when you're IKEA-sized and your methods aren't perfect, the thing falls to pieces. So you have to have good methods when you're IKEA-sized. So they're not denying the power of the Holy Spirit, but methods and systems and processes just matter more when there are bigger numbers, because you have to, otherwise it falls to pieces. There's too many people not to have precise systems in place. So they just need it more. But in small churches principles center on relationships, culture, and history. So let me walk you through the difference between those. First of all, relationships. How many of you pastored in the 1990s? Most of you are younger here, but got a couple, okay. So you know that in the 1990s, we were all legally required to write a mission statement. It was mission statement decade, man. They discovered that every big growing church had a mission statement, so that was going to be the answer. We're all going to become big, great churches if we all have a good mission statement. And we all got together and we all wrote it, and then nobody's heard about it since then. Because in a big church, you have to have a precise mission statement, because the pastor isn't going to be at 90% of the meetings. And so the mission statement keeps everybody on task. But in a small church, everybody's at everything. So in a small church, a mission statement doesn't keep us on task. It feels manipulative. I've had pastors, and more than pastors, church members, why can't we just do the Great Commandment and the Great Commission? And you know what my answer is now? You can. They've done well for 2,000 years. They'll do fine until Jesus returns. Now, in a bigger church, you have to refine Great Commandment and Great Commission to something specific, again, because there won't be a physical presence of a pastor or staff member in these meetings, and so they have to know how to stay on task, and a memorable mission statement helps do that. So the bigger the church, the more important a mission statement is. The smaller a church, the less important it is. The Venn diagram going in and out, okay? So, because it's about relationships in a smaller church. Secondly, culture. Now, when I say culture, I don't mean contemporary, traditional, casual, formal. That style, that surface. I'm talking culture, which is the stuff beneath the surface. When I say the culture of a church, what I mean is the unwritten rules that everybody goes by, even if they're not aware of it. In fact, the strongest culture enforcers in your church may have no idea they're enforcing a culture. We've always done it this way, is a statement of culture. And the people who are insisting on it have no idea they're doing it. Culture is the unwritten rules by which every church operates. And we got to go back to the beginning word of the session, discovering. In a big church, the pastor and pastoral staff establish, create, and promote the culture. Because when you walk into a church of 1,000 or more, you don't expect to influence the culture. You expect to be told what the culture is and what the mission is, and I'll agree with it or not agree with it and stay or don't stay based on whether I agree with it or not agree with it. I don't expect to change it. I just want to know what it is. But in a small church, culture is huge. In a small church, it's established by the people who've been there, by their relationships, by their history, by their background, by the good and bad things that have happened. And as a pastor, we have some influence on affecting it. That's what leadership is about anyway. But we don't create it. We have to discover it. Now, what do I mean by culture? The best illustration I know of it is Jesus' parable of the sower. And he tells a story of the sower going out to sow a seed. And the seed is good. Seed doesn't change. So the seed in this, as we'll use it today, is the mission or the vision or the new idea that you've got for the church. And it's a good idea. It's a good seed. And in some churches, we toss out that seed, and some churches, the reaction every time is, not going to do that in my church. If that's the reaction you get, then you've got a church that is the first type of ground. It's the hard ground. The seed lands, it doesn't penetrate, the birds come up and pick it, and there's no harvest because it's too hard. So what do we have to do? We have to soften the culture of our church. It's a hard culture. You cannot sow a good seed into a bad culture. If you've been frustrated trying to put a good seed, you've got great ideas, good mission, I know this is where God wants us to go, and they keep resisting. The problem is not the mission, the problem is the culture. There's a saying in business right now, and it's a really good one. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. What that means is you can have a great strategy and a great mission, and if you're trying to put it into bad soil, it will not work. So before we spend all of this energy on the next new mission or the next new vision or the next new event or the next new idea, you've got to figure out, is my culture sick? And if so, I have to make it healthy so I have a good place to plant the seed. Otherwise, I'm going to waste the seed. So the first one is a stubborn culture. Or maybe you've got a culture in which you present an idea and they go, that's a great idea, Pastor, let's do that. And then nobody shows up for the planning meeting. Why? Second soil. Jesus says it goes in and it penetrates. And a little bit of a bud comes up. But then it dies in the heat of the day when it's called upon to do some work. Why? Because it's shallow. It can't go deep enough. So if you've got a church culture that says yes to great ideas, but nobody follows through, you have a shallow church culture. And you've got to help deepen it. You got to help go deep. You may have to spend some time in real serious scripture study of what the church is supposed to be about and what the mission really is, and reestablishing mission back into the church if you've got a shallow culture. Or you've got another culture that says, great idea, Pastor, let's do that. We'll add it to the 17 other things we're doing this week. And that's the third type, where it grows up, but there's so many weeds and thistles and thorns that it chokes out the good stuff. It's a busy church culture. There's just so much going on that nothing new can get traction. There's a lot of our churches that are just doing too much stuff. It's like the restaurant makeover show that says you can't do 179 things out of that tiny little kitchen. I'm going to give you one page of 5 items, all on a theme, and you're going to be the best restaurant in town that does just that food. And every time the restaurateur resists it and goes, oh, no, we can't just do that. What about this? So we got a regular who loves such and such. Yeah, but you got like 3 regulars, dude. Right? Nobody in town is doing gourmet burgers, or nobody in town is doing gastropub, or nobody in town is doing such and such. You can do it in your kitchen. You can have 5 items that you can be practically world-renowned, certainly regionally renowned for, but you can't have 50 items that you're renowned for. You'll do 50 items badly, or you can do 5 items really, really well. And in small churches, those are the kinds of choices we need to make. But the busy culture says we're going to try to do it all, and it all gets choked out and nothing gets done. So we got to get rid of the weeds. Got to get rid of the extras. We'll talk about how to do that in the next session. And then the fourth culture, it goes in, it goes deep, it takes root, it blooms, and it produces a harvest. Why? Because it's not hard, and it is deep, and it's not overwhelmed with other things. That's a healthy church culture. Right, so we have to figure out what culture is. Now, how do you figure that out in your church? The best resource I know for that is a book that a friend of mine wrote called Culture Wins. Culture Wins just came out by Vanderbloemen, and he's got some good stuff on it. But better for small churches is a book called Dirt Matters by Jim Powell. And if you go to the URL on the right there, thenewsmallchurch.com/Arlington, there's a link to his book on those notes. So Dirt Matters by Jim Powell. He was actually raised on a farm. He pastors a church in Peoria, Illinois, loves small churches, wrote this from a small church perspective, and he goes through everything I just talked about, and then he says, here's how to discover what the culture of your church is, and here's how to change it over to a healthy culture. Best, very short book, very simple, very practical. It will help you better than any church I know. If you feel like the issue in your church may not be a mission problem, but maybe a culture problem, Dirt Matters is the best place I know to go to get that. So check that out. So that's culture. And then the third one is history. Small towns have long memories. And so do small churches. There are history enforcers in your church if you've been around for any, or if the church has been around for any length of time, and especially if you haven't. So if you are new to an old church, this is particularly important for you today. Do not ignore the history of your church. Here's the challenge we get. We're trying to pull our church towards a preferred future, and it feels like the history of the church is like an anchor pulling us back. Anybody ever had that experience? Pretty much everybody, right? Then what we want to do is we want to push even further into the future. And the more we push, the more the history keeps pulling us back. Why won't they do this? Why is it always happening? And the answer to it isn't to try to push them even further away from their history. It is to let some slack come in and actually go and dig into that history. Because here's what you'll find. Churches were not planted by sticks in the mud and old fuddy-duddies. Churches are planted by pioneers and visionaries. And if you go back and rediscover why the church was started in the first place, whether it's your denomination or your individual congregation, you will find very inspiring, very forward-looking ideas and quotes and thoughts. And then you can go to the history enforcers in your church and you can go, look what I just found from the founding pastor. Or look what John Wimber said about moving the church forward into the future. Or look what Chuck Smith said about what he wanted Calvary Chapel to be. I know you love the history of this church. Here's part of the history of this church. Give you an example of how it happened in ours. A few years ago, we were about to celebrate our 50th anniversary as a church. So we got out all the stuff from the archives. We put pictures out and documents and everything else. And I'm going through it all in the lobby, and I see this one picture, and I see this one newspaper article, and it's this. This is the picture I took of it. The church can work with delinquents. I love that title. It's from the early 60s, just a year or two after our church started. And you'll see in the first paragraph, it was written by someone who calls themselves an institutional caseworker and probation officer. And he's been looking for, can the church actually help? Now, if you're under 40, delinquent doesn't mean they're late on their bills. Delinquents are what we used to call kids that we now call at-risk youth. We used to call them juvenile delinquents. So we're talking about at-risk youth here. My church was started with the mission of reaching the kids that other churches couldn't reach. Stated by the founding pastor in a document that I have now on my phone that I can pull out any time. And I read that and I took the picture because I'm looking out my window in our parking lot, which has limited parking to begin with, we have the only skate park in town. Because 15 years ago, when we resurfaced our parking lot, all of a sudden there's noise outside, and all the kids had shown up on their skateboards because we now had the smoothest surface in town. And so our youth pastor and I said, okay, we've got a choice. We can either find and put up a whole bunch of no skateboarding signs, or we can put up some ramps. And we decided churches on defense put up signs and churches on offense put up ramps. And we're always going to stay on offense. And we went around and we begged for every piece of scrap we could find and cobbled together this ridiculous, ugly-looking skateboard park. And the kids showed up from everywhere because we had the only one in town. More kids have come to Christ, more families have come to Christ through that skateboard park than probably anything else we've done in the last 15 years. And we didn't do it because we said, oh, the cool new church down the street is doing a skateboard park. We did it because they were in our parking lot. They're on site already. Take advantage of it. What's in your neighborhood? What's happening immediately outside your doors? And how do you go out to them and minister to them? Be on offense, not defense. And so we discovered that. And then I saw that and thought, I'm going to take that picture because if anybody ever comes to me and goes, I can't believe you got a skateboard park in the parking lot, the founders of this church would be appalled. Oh, really? The church can work with juvenile delinquents. That's what our founding pastor said. Right? You can use your past to propel you into your future. If you look through your founding documents, you will find gold like that from the founders who had visionary ideas. Because people don't start new churches because they want to do the things the way they've always done them. They'd have stayed in their old church if they wanted to do it the way it had always been done. So we can honor the past. Well, or the way I like to put it is this. We need to do what our founders, don't do what your founders did. Think like your founders thought. We think we're honoring the founders of our church by duplicating their methods. They weren't method duplicators. That's why they started something new. We have to think the way they thought. How do we do a new thing for a new generation using the same gospel that hasn't changed in 2,000 years? We got to think like they thought. So what do we do from that point on? We got half a minute. I'm going to give you this quick story. An old story about a guy who's walking around a farm and he walks around the side of a barn and he sees that an archer has been shooting arrows against the side of a barn. And there are 5 painted targets on the side of the barn, and in the center of each target there's an arrow. Dead center. And he looks at the archer and back at the targets and he goes, wow, you must be practicing a long time to hit 5 targets dead center. How'd you get so good? The archer doesn't say anything. Pulls the 5 arrows from the targets, puts them in his quiver, walks around the other side of the barn. There's nothing on that side of the barn except the barn door. He aims for the barn door, lets an arrow go, and it goes 20 feet off to the left. Well, that's weird. Shoots another one at the barn door, 20 feet off to the right. What's going on here? 5 arrows, 5 complete misses. But the archer's not upset. The archer goes and grabs a paintbrush and paints a target around where each arrow hit the barn. And now each target is dead center. That to me is a great illustration of how we start figuring out what our church is supposed to do well. Because what happens is, if that archer had shot 100 arrows instead of 5, you'd discover that arrows tend to clump. 100 arrows, maybe 50 of them hit randomly with no order whatsoever, but 25 of them are kind of in this area, and 25 are kind of in that area. Which means this archer in this spot with these weather conditions, with that sun in their eyes, with those types of arrows, whatever, the entire thing of this all coming together tends to mean I'm going to hit those 2 spots more often. So what do? Get out a paintbrush, paint a big old target around those 2 spots, and now aim there on purpose. Because if you've been hitting those 2 targets by mistake, imagine how often you'll hit them if you try to do it on purpose. So, what does that mean for the church? Here's what it means. You want to figure out what your vision is, what your mission statement should be, and what you should do as a church? Don't sit and think about it. Don't even sit and just pray about it. Pray about it, yes, but don't just pray about it. And think about it, yes, but don't just think about it. Start doing stuff. Start shooting arrows. What arrows? I don't know, Great Commandment, Great Commission arrows. Do the Jesus stuff. Do the stuff that every church is supposed to do. But now, start paying attention to what works. Watch where your arrows hit. And what you'll discover is a theme to the things that work. Now, it may be a different theme than you're looking for. You in your head right now, because this is how most pastors think, may have an age-appropriate theme. We want to reach kids, or we want to reach youth, or we want to reach young adults, or we want to reach seniors. But when we try this for seniors, it works, and that one doesn't work. And we try this for youth, it works, but that one doesn't work. When we try for this kids, it works. We're never successful in any age group. Maybe we don't have a mission. Oh, no. Take a look at what did work for seniors, for youth, for young marrieds, for kids. And what is the theme of the thing that did work? And what you may discover is, oh, every time we did benevolence, everybody showed up. Or every time we did evangelism, everybody showed up. Or every time we did it with a missions orientation, everybody showed up. So it's not about age appropriate, it's about, oh, we're a recovery church. We discovered that a few years ago. What I discovered was we don't have a lot of first-time conversions in our church, and it frustrated me to no end, and it still frustrates me to a certain degree because the Great Commission, kind of matters. But what we were doing was we were rechurching de-churched people. So it wasn't first-time conversions, but it was coming back to Jesus. And what we discovered was they leave for college, they fall away from the Lord, they get married and have kids, or they have kids and then get married. And the 7-year-old comes to them one day and goes, Daddy, who's Jesus? And Daddy goes, oh, what have I done? I got to get my kid in a church. But I don't want to go back to the church I left. That's why we left it. And they hear from their neighbor, check out Cornerstone. It's kind of different. You and your kids might like it. And they show up and they go, oh, yeah, this feels right to me. Not everybody. Some walk out and go, what a bunch of weirdos. But the ones, our weirdos, like it. Right? And they come back, oh, okay. Not a lot of first-time conversions. And we discovered that and we went, oh, we do that well. Let's do that on purpose now. We also discovered that we send people off into mission really, really well. We're always losing our A-team, constantly losing our A-team. We've invested in them. We've put money into them, time, resources. They're just great. They're just beginning to really be good on the worship team, or they're just beginning to lead Sunday school really, really well. And then some other pastor calls them and offers to pay them to do that. And they're so unholy, they want a roof over their head and clothes on their back, so they take the paying gig. It happens constantly. And we discovered we're doing that. We didn't choose to, I wouldn't have chosen to do something that loses good people. That would not have been my choice. Right? But several years ago we discovered, wow, we keep saying goodbye to these great people. And it's not because they're mad at us, it's because they're going off in a full-time ministry. So I go to the board and I go, I think that's part of our mission. But are we okay with investing time, energy, resources, and money into people who, as soon as they get good enough to pay us back, will leave because some other church is going to pay them? And to a person, our entire leadership says it sounds like kingdom growth to us. Let's do it. So now we do it on purpose. We lose good people on purpose. A kid who was raised in our church was my youth pastor's son, still is. My youth pastor's son. We actually helped to pay for him to go to Hillsong. He played some guitar, so we put him on stage. He got better and played really good and then wanted to go to Hillsong. We helped raise some money to send him. His family paid most of it, but we helped a little bit. He comes back to Orange County, and what's he doing now? He's the worship leader at the new Hillsong in Orange County. 6 miles away. We paid for that in many, many, many ways. And you know how good you got to be leading in worship on a Hillsong campus? And he's over there doing it for them like they need another worship leader. And I'm joking about it because it's true, but there's no jealousy. Every time I see a picture of him on Instagram in front of a big crowd of people leading at Hillsong, I'll go. I'll even sit there and take some credit for it. We're contributing to the kingdom. And would we have picked that? No. Nobody strategizes that. That's a dumb strategy. But when you're doing it already and you choose to go, I'm going to lean into that for the sake of the kingdom, that's where our arrows hit. And then once you discover it, you discover what your church does well, then do it on purpose. And then what you got to do is front load the value. By front loading the value, I mean, once you figure out what you do well, don't let people wade through all kinds of stuff you do badly in order to get the stuff you do well. Once you figure out what you do well, then write something, and if you want to call it a mission statement, fine. You know why most of our mission statements didn't work? Because they were based on something we wanted to be and not something we were. But if you look at it and go, okay, we do this already fairly well by mistake. Let's do it on purpose and become really good at it. And then after you become really good at it, then write out a statement that says, we're the church that does this. 2 quick examples, then we'll go for lunch. One from a mega church, one from a small church. Mega church, Hillsong. Remember when they first started coming out with all these songs, right? Probably Shout to the Lord was the first one that all kind of registered with all of us. And I'm thinking, man, all these songs come out of this church that just happens to be named Hillsong. There's no just happens to it. It used to be called Sydney Hill Community Church. And then they started being known for their songs. So Brian Houston goes, we're known for our songs. Let's change our name and put song in the name. Now, as a pastor, imagine what that took. Because you heard Darlene Check's name before you ever heard Brian Houston's name. And the ego that he had to put down to go, I'm going to promote what my worship pastor is doing. She's known worldwide for her songs. I'm going to put song in the title of the church to push her out even more front, even it pushes me in the back. That's some pretty good leadership right there. Now, I'm not telling you to change your church name, but that's how they did it. You can't touch that church without knowing they're about songs because it's in the stinking name. Talk about putting it out front. They don't hide their value. They put it right in the name. Small church example. Little church in Ione, California. I-O-N-E. You can Google it. The state prison that's just outside the border of town has more people in it than the town has in it. They call it their neighbors in the gated community. That is what the pastor calls it, the gated community next door. It's the state prison. Men's prison, because the men's prison is next door, you got a whole bunch of women in town who are married to or girlfriends of the men in the prison, and including their kids. And so a few years ago, the streets of Ione started getting overrun by these kids who don't have good father figures because dad's in the gated community next door. And mom showed up without a job. So mom's probably doing things on the street that she shouldn't be doing to put food in their belly. And this tiny little church, the Assembly of God in Ione, California, looked around and said, somebody's got to help these kids. And then they realized, well, we're the one with the heart for it, so we're the one with the job. And they partnered with other groups like Rural Compassion. And every year before school comes, they have a big backpack drive. And they give a backpack to every kid who needs it for school. 3 or 4 times a year, they do other programs from food to distributing school supplies to other stuff. They take care of the kids on the street in their town. And you cannot touch that church without seeing Ione Assembly of God, the church that cares for kids. If you go to their Facebook page today, well, I can't say today, it was there yesterday. I haven't checked today. They better keep it up. I put it in the book. On their Facebook page is a picture of their church building hidden behind a bounce house. And the saying, the church that cares for kids. You can't touch that church without knowing what they're about. They didn't choose that mission. The mission chose them. But they bought it, and they put it out front, and they say, this is who we are. So what do? Start shooting arrows. Do the Jesus stuff. Pay attention to what works. See if you can find a common theme to the things that work. Then do it on purpose, and then tell everybody, this is who we are and what we do. And you notice what I'm bringing you to is not saying, hey, here's a cool idea that church did, do it this way. Don't borrow another template from another church. Figure out the DNA of your church. Figure out what God has called your church to do and be by noticing what you do well, and then just do it better. Be the church God has designed you to be. And we as pastors get to do the process of discovery and then promoting that. And we'll get into some more details on how that happens next session. But I think it's lunch break.